Tobias Redmont hadn't spoken to another soul in 8 years, unless you counted the wind, the rain, or the horses that still tolerated his presence. His ranch, perched on a lonely ridge in the New Mexico territory, was more graveyard than homestead now. The front porch still creaked like it remembered laughter. The rocking chair still faced west like it expected someone to come home. But no one ever did. Tobias had buried his voice, along with his wife and daughter, taken by a raid gone wrong, and in the silence that followed he had found something darker than grief peace. A bitter, choking kind of peace that numbed everything it touched. He was oil in the leather of an old bridle when it began the storm, angry and sudden, as if God had something to prove. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled the window panes, and the rain came in sheets hammering the roof like judgment. That's when he heard it, the knock. Not a polite tap, not a curious rap from a traveler needing directions. This was desperation, a frantic pounding that seemed more plea than intrusion. Tobias froze oil-stained rag, clutched in one hand the other, hovering near the rifle mounted above the fireplace. No one came to his ranch. Not anymore. He'd made sure of that. Then came voices. Not English, not Spanish, Apache. His chest tightened like a rope had been pulled taut around his ribs. Last time he heard that language, his daughter's dress had still hung by the window. Last time strangers came speaking Apache, he dug 2 graves by dawn. The knocking came again, louder, closer, a voice now rising above the others, carved from grit and stone. "Please, we know you're in there. We need shelter only for tonight." Tobias pressed a palm to the door. Through the thick wood, he felt the tremor of their voices, urgent, frightened, human. His fingers brushed the iron bar that had stayed bolted for nearly a decade. 8 years, he whispered to himself. 8 years of silence broken by a storm and a stranger's voice. He should walk away, pretend he didn't hear, let the wind drown them out like it had drowned everything else. But something in that voice cut through his scars like a knife. Not demanding, not commanding, begging. He opened the peephole. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. 10 women stood in the storm, soaked to the bone, their dresses torn, faces streaked with rain and mud and blood. The youngest couldn't be older than 16, clutching a bundle wrapped in damp cloth. A baby. The oldest had silver in her braids and eyes like burnt coals, cold hard, but not empty. These weren't lost wives or wandering widows. These were survivors. And standing at their front chin, held high despite the crimson streak on her cheek, was the woman who had spoken. Her eyes locked on Tobias's through the crack. "My name is Ayana," she said. "These are my daughters, my sisters. We are being hunted. If you leave us out here, we will die. And when they find our bodies at your door, you will die too." Tobias's hand rested on the iron bar. His entire body screamed, "Don't." But something older, deeper, something human moved his arm. The bar came free with a groan, like even the door itself was reluctant. Tobias opened it, and Death stepped inside wrapped in wet wool and Apache braids. They filed past him like ghosts. No one spoke. A few nodded, but most kept their eyes down. All save Ayana. She held his gaze as she entered, rain dripping from her chin like blood from a blade. She stopped only long enough to whisper, "The soldiers who hunt us are close. Maybe an hour, maybe less." Tobias said nothing. Just locked the door again, slid the bar back in place, and stared into the fire that suddenly didn't seem warm enough. "What did you do?" he finally asked. Ayana turned her wet dress clinging to lean muscle and torn skin. "We lived," she said. "When they expected us to die, we ran. When they demanded we kneel, and when they burned our village and took everything, we fought back. She didn't weep. None of them did. But the baby whimpered, and that sound was somehow more terrible than all the thunder outside. Tobias felt the old feeling stir in his belly. Not fear, not anger, resolve. "How many are coming?" he asked. Ayanna looked toward the door. 8, maybe 10, led by a man named Captain Morrison. He's been hunting Apache for months, claims we're hostile, but the real threat is anyone who survives long enough to speak of what he's done. Tobias walked to the window, peering through the gaps in the shutters. Nothing moved. Yet. He turned back to her. There's a cellar beneath the kitchen. Stone walls. Hidden hatch. Ayanna shook her head. "If they find us there, you die too." Tobias gave a bitter smile. "Lady, I became their enemy the day I chose not to lie down in the dirt with my family. Let them come." Ayanna blinked once. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. She saw something in him, and Tobias saw something in her too, not just a survivor, a leader, a woman who had buried people too. The storm shifted, and with it so did Tobias Redmont. The recluse who hadn't opened his door in 8 years now found himself opening something far more dangerous, his soul. Somewhere out in that rain, soldiers were drawing closer. But what they didn't know, what they'd never expect, was that they weren't about to corner prey. They were about to walk into the jaws of something that had been waiting too long to remember what it felt like to fight. And Tobias Redmont was done being silent. The door creaked open with the sound of rust giving up a fight. Tobias Redmont stood in the framed silhouette, cast by flickering firelight, a rifle slung across his shoulder like a limb he'd forgotten how to live without. The storm howled behind the 10 women on his porch, but none flinched, not even the youngest, who clutched a silent bundle close to her chest. Lightning illuminated their faces, mud-streaked, rain-slick, bloodied, but unbroken. The one who stepped forward didn't wait for permission. "I am Ayanna," she said, eyes locked on Tobias. Her words were carved, not spoken, shaped by years of carrying a dying language through a world that wanted it silent. "These are my daughters, my sisters. We have walked for 3 days. Our feet bleed. Our bellies are empty. But we will not beg." Tobias didn't move, didn't speak. He just looked first at the baby wrapped in rags that barely kept the cold out, then at the faces of women who had stared death in the teeth and chosen to keep walking. He stepped aside, not out of charity, not out of mercy, but because something in Ayanna's gaze reminded him of Sarah, his wife's stubbornness, her fire, her refusal to die easy. These weren't strangers. These were echoes of what he'd lost. One by one they entered. Shadows made flesh. Water dripped from their hair, their torn dresses forming puddles on the wooden floor. The baby gave a faint cry, barely a sound, and Tobias's jaw tightened. He hadn't heard the sound of a baby since before the graves. Ayanna was the last to cross the threshold. As she passed him, she murmured low enough that only he could hear, "The soldiers are close. We don't have long." Tobias barred the door behind her. The lock clicked into place like a line being drawn. He turned to face her, voice rough like unused gravel. "Why are they chasing you?" Ayanna didn't answer at first. She walked to the hearth where the women now gathered, their skin steaming as fire met freezing skin. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from restraint. Then, slowly, she lifted her dress sleeve. A fresh welt, deep, bruised, ugly. "They came to our village with flags and papers," she began, voice as flat as the prairie. "Said they were there to ensure peace. said we were under federal protection. Then they set fire to our homes, shot our men, and took the rest. Tobias didn't ask what the rest meant. He'd worn the uniform once. He knew. Ayanna continued. We were supposed to kneel. We were supposed to die quietly. We didn't. Some of us ran. Some of us fought. I slit a sergeant's throat while he slept after he... Her voice caught for the first time, and her eyes flicked to the youngest girl in the room. He will not hurt anyone else. The room fell silent. Rain slammed the windows like fists. Outside, thunder rumbled closer like boots on the march. But inside the cabin, there was a stillness as heavy as a grave. Tobias stared into the fire, remembering another night, another storm, another knock. He remembered the soldiers who came offering help, promising protection. He remembered digging through the rubble of what used to be his home, pulling his daughter's doll from the ash. He remembered kindness dying in his arms. Ayanna stepped beside him. You owe us nothing, she said. But if you send us back out there, we will die. And when they find our bodies on your land, you will die too. They leave no witnesses. Tobias looked at her. No fear in her eyes. Just truth. I've been dying for years, he muttered. Then maybe tonight is a good night to start living again, she said. Something snapped inside him. 8 years of grief, of silence, of rotting behind his own walls burned away in a flash of firelight and fury. These women hadn't stumbled onto his land by accident. They had come carrying the weight of justice unfulfilled, and justice had always found a place in Tobias Redmont's blood even when peace had abandoned it. You say they're close, he asked. Ayanna nodded. Less than an hour. He walked to the wall where an old cabinet stood locked with rusted chains. His hands didn't hesitate. The chains fell away. The doors creaked open, and inside, like sleeping demons, lay his tools. Not tools for farming. Not tools for peace. A repeating rifle. A sawed-off shotgun. Powdered charges wrapped in oilcloth. Ayanna's eyes widened slightly. You were a soldier, she said. Tobias shook his head. No, I was something worse. I built railroads through mountains. I made rock and earth move where men said it couldn't. Then the war came, and they paid me to make people disappear instead of stone. Ayanna studied him carefully, and now he looked at her eyes sharp again after too long, dulled by loss. Now I build consequences. He turned to the women by the fire. There's a cellar beneath the kitchen, hidden, reinforced. If you hide, they might leave me standing. Ayanna didn't hesitate. We don't hide. A younger woman stepped forward, her lips split, one arm hanging limp. We're not victims, she said through clenched teeth. We're survivors, and if they come here another added, we'll show them what that means. Tobias felt something strange pull at his chest pride. Not his. Theirs. Their defiance stirred something ancient in him. A man could survive with bitterness in his gut, but he only truly lived when he chose a side. Outside, a horse neighed, boots sloshed through mud. They're here, Ayanna said. Tobias didn't flinch. He grabbed his rifle, checked the chamber, and walked to the window. Shadows moved beyond the trees. Not many. A scouting team, maybe. Advance riders. We have minutes, he said. Then we use every second, Ayanna replied. And in that moment, with the fire behind them and death at the door, Tobias and Ayanna became more than strangers. They became allies, not by blood, but by choice. Tobias Redmont had seen ambushes before, led them, survived them, bled in the aftermath of them. But nothing could have prepared him for what unfolded in the firelight of his own living room. It started with a glance. Ayana, standing at the edge of the room, gave the subtlest nod, and the change was immediate, like a string pulled tight had finally snapped. The women moved with practiced ease. One reached beneath her soaked dress and pulled free a curved blade, its edge still stained from their flight. Another knelt by the hearth, rolling up her sleeve to reveal a forearm wrapped in braided leather strips that unwound into sling cords. A third adjusted the baby's cloth, revealing not just a child beneath, but sharpened flint tucked into the folds like teeth in waiting. They weren't cold. They weren't afraid. They weren't refugees. They were warriors. Tobias stood motionless as the reality sank in. Every scrape on their bodies, every tear in their garments, every tremble he'd mistaken for fear deception. Not meant to mislead him, but to fool the enemy who thought they were prey. He opened his mouth, but Ayana was already watching him. "You were never going to hide," he said. She stepped forward, the dim fire catching the edge of her blade. "We hoped for shelter, but we prepared for war." There was no arrogance in her tone, only fact, cold, sharp, inevitable. Tobias felt something uncoil in his chest, respect laced with dread. "I thought I was taking in broken souls," he said. Ayana met his eyes. "You were, but broken things can cut deeper." A crash of thunder outside. Then silence, the kind that crawled up your spine when death was near. He walked to the window. Movement in the trees, shapes shifting in the dark. Not a full force, not yet, but enough. "They'll be close now," Tobias muttered. "Checking exits, looking for weakness." "We left signs," one of the women said behind him. "Footprints in the mud. A bloody cloth on the trail. They believe we're wounded. Disorganized. They believe they've already won," Ayana added. Tobias turned back to her. "They haven't." He crossed the room to a cabinet he hadn't touched in a decade. Inside were tools he'd sworn never to hold again. But tonight, oaths were less sacred than survival. He pulled out a case wrapped in waxed canvas and laid it on the table. With practiced hands, he unrolled it, revealing explosives wires and metal fragments shaped like teeth. The women watched, unreadable. "Railroad demolition kit," Tobias said, "built to move mountains." "Can it stop men?" Ayana asked. Tobias loaded 2 charges and looked up. "It can bury them." Ayana studied him. "You've done this before." He nodded slowly. "Too many times. During the war, after the war. They sent me into places they didn't want to talk about later." "Is that why you disappeared?" "No," Tobias said, locking eyes with her. "I disappeared after I trusted the wrong man in uniform. Thought he came in peace. He left me with ashes." The room went quiet. Even the storm seemed to hush like it was listening. "I buried my wife and daughter with the flag they said would protect them," Tobias continued. "Tonight I bury something else." A woman by the door whispered, "You should still run. You've done enough." Tobias shook his head. "I've done nothing for 8 years. Tonight I earned the right to stop hiding." He turned to Ayana. "You led them here." Why? Ayana didn't flinch. "Because I heard of a man who once held off 6 bandits to save a child that wasn't his. A man who built a dam to stop a flood from drowning a town that wouldn't let him inside." "That man died," Tobias said. She stepped closer, voice low. "Maybe, but grief is not a coffin. It's a door, and I think you're tired of living behind it." A beat passed. 2. Then Tobias nodded. "What's the plan?" Ayana moved quickly, motioning her women into formation like a commander on familiar ground. "We let them get close," she said. "Let them see the fire, hear soft voices. They'll expect panic, surrender, a weak rancher and scared women. And what they'll find," Tobias said, loading a shell into his rifle, "is hell. Outside a horse neighed. A boot crunched in wet gravel. Tobias peered through the shutter slats. 3 soldiers, scouting rifles ready, moving slow, looking for entry points. "They'll test the barn first," he whispered. A woman stepped forward. "It's already wired. Traps, tripwire. Fire jar. Enough to scare, not kill. We want them to come here." Ayana's voice cut through the room. "Let the captain believe he's leading us to our end. Let him taste certainty." Tobias gave a grim smile, and then rip it from his throat. He motioned toward the fireplace. Back entrance is narrow. Stone walls. One of you guards it. If they break through, you light the second charge. Bring the wall down. The women nodded. Not one asked what would happen if they were inside when the wall fell. Tobias turned back to Ayana. "Your sisters know what this means." "They've known since we buried our first children," she answered. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then a horn sounded in the trees. One sharp note. A signal. "They're coming," Tobias said. Ayana raised her blade, and in the firelight it gleamed like the edge of prophecy. "For our dead," she said. For the living, Tobias answered. The storm outside had less fury than the room within. The first flash of torchlight slithered through the trees like the tongue of a snake tasting blood. It was followed by another, then another, until the darkness around Tobias Redmont's ranch glowed with the fire of men too confident to hide. "They're spreading out," Tobias whispered, peering through the shutters. "Standard formation, flank and press. They think we're already broken." Ayana stood beside him, still as a stone, her blade drawn and cradled low, gleaming with silent promise. Outside, voices called to each other, low, assured, disciplined. Soldiers, predators, men who believed themselves untouchable. A single voice rose above the rest. "Rancher," the man bellowed, "this is Captain Nathaniel Morrison of the United States Army. You are harboring fugitives. Surrender now, and we may spare your life." Tobias snorted. "Same lie they told my wife." Ayana's eyes never left the window. "Morrison's the one who burned our village, who smiled while our men died, who took my youngest sister into his tent and—" Her voice cut off. Her jaw clenched. Tonight, he finds out what it means to beg. The plan was already in motion. The cellar door was wired. Tripwires crisscrossed the back exit. Tobias had positioned oil-filled jars, primitive but effective firebombs above the front porch, eaves ready to fall and burst into flames on impact. Still, he checked his rifle one more time. Old habit, old scars. The women moved like shadows behind him, each one in position. Their eyes held no fear, only fury tempered by patience. Then came the crash. The barn door blew open, kicked inward by a soldier too sure of himself. He took 3 steps inside, then came the pop of a tripwire and a sudden whoosh of fire. The night lit up as a jar burst overhead, splashing flame across wood and hay. Horses screamed. The man staggered out, his uniform aflame, crashing to the dirt while his comrades screamed his name. Panic. Confusion. Perfect. "They'll rush the main house now," Tobias said, "thinking we're cornered." Ayana raised her hand and gave a signal. A woman by the back wall lit a fuse, dropped a small charge into a tin bucket, and waited. The blast would sound like a rifle crack meant to mimic desperation. They heard it. Morrison cursed. "Move in, take the house, no survivors." They came like wolves. Tobias took the first shot. The soldier nearest the front porch dropped blood blooming from his neck. Another tried to raise his rifle, but caught a blade to the ribs from a woman who emerged from the side shadows with a scream like thunder. Ayana was already moving. She moved with the grace of something not quite human part, fury part vengeance. Her blade slashed through the air, a silver arc that painted death across the night. A man screamed as she drove steel into his thigh and twisted, dropping him like a sack of grain before turning to the next. Gunfire exploded from the tree line. Tobias ducked, rolled to the right, and fired again. One shot, one kill. He didn't waste bullets. "Fall back," a soldier yelled. "They're fighting. It's a trap." But it was too late. The Apache women had turned the house into a kill box, and now the soldiers who thought they were hunting ghosts were finding themselves haunted. The front door burst open. Morrison stepped inside like he still believed in his authority. His coat was soaked, his boots mud-caked, but his arrogance remained intact until he saw Tobias, and the rifle aimed directly at his chest. Hugh Morrison growled. Tobias said nothing, just stared. "What is this? You helping savages now. You know what that makes you, rancher?" Tobias tightened his grip on the trigger. "Alive," he said. He fired. But Morrison moved fast. The bullet grazed his shoulder as he dove to the side, crashing into the dining table. He rolled, came up with a pistol, and fired twice. Tobias ducked one shot, smashing through a cupboard, the other missing entirely. Ayanna was already moving silent, lethal, inevitable. Morrison turned, saw her coming, and raised his weapon. But she was faster. She struck his wrist with the back of her blade, sending the pistol clattering to the floor. Then she grabbed his collar, yanked him forward, and whispered, "This is for my sister." The knife slid between his ribs. Morrison gasped, staggered, and looked directly into her eyes. "Not like this," he choked. Ayanna leaned closer. "You never gave us a choice." She twisted. Morrison collapsed to the floor, blood pouring from his mouth. Tobias stepped forward, breathing hard, rifle still ready. "You sure he's dead?" he asked. Ayanna wiped the blade on Morrison's coat. "If he's not, I'll make sure." Tobias looked down at the captain's lifeless body and felt nothing. No triumph, no closure, just silence. Until another sound reached their ears. A voice, shouting from the dark. "Captain, are you inside?" Sir Tobias rushed to the window. More torches, more horses, reinforcements. "Damn it," he hissed. That wasn't the whole unit. Ayanna joined him. How many? Tobias counted the lights. 15, maybe 20. Coming fast. Ayanna's face hardened. "We fight." Tobias looked at her, really looked. Blood on her cheek, hair matted with rain. Hands shaken just barely from the adrenaline crash. She looked like vengeance carved from bone. But beneath that hope. For her people. For survival. "No," he said finally. "We finish what we started." Outside, the storm eased. Inside, the house reeked of blood smoke and justice. Captain Morrison was dead, but the real war had just begun. Smoke coiled from the porch like a warning. Captain Morrison's body lay crumpled by the hearth blood seeping into the floorboards like spilled ink. The storm outside had slowed, but a new kind of thunder rolled across the hills, steady, deliberate, and devastating. Hoofbeats. Not a handful this time. Dozens. Tobias Redmont heard it first, that low tremble of the earth that told you something bigger than you was coming. He stepped onto the porch rifle, still warm in his hands, eyes narrowing toward the tree line. That's when he saw them. Rows of torches moving in formation. Uniforms. Discipline. Precision. Not a ragtag band of hunters like Morrison's squad. No, this was organized. This was authority. Ayanna stepped beside him. Reinforcements. Tobias didn't answer right away. He was watching the man at the center of the formation, a tall figure on a black horse, flanked by mounted guards. Even in the rain-dimmed light, his coat gleamed with brass. He sat with the kind of arrogance that could only be bred from absolute power. Colonel Tobias muttered, "Bradley?" Ayanna's face went still. Morrison's superior. Tobias nodded grimly. And not just that. The man who gave him orders. Maybe the man who built the entire campaign. The colonel raised a hand. His column stopped. Then his voice rang out clear and commanding. "This is Colonel Abraham Bradley of the United States Army. You are surrounded. Lay down your weapons and you may live long enough to be tried." Tobias exchanged a glance with Ayanna. "They brought a full company," she said softly. "We cannot fight that." He didn't argue. She was right. 50, maybe 60 men. Rifles, bayonets, trained. And inside the house, 9 women, a wounded teenager, a baby, and a rancher who hadn't seen real combat in nearly a decade. "We don't stand a chance," Ayanna admitted. Tobias turned back toward the house. The women were reloading weapons, tying makeshift bandages, some whispering final words to each other. No panic, just grim resolve. "They're not afraid," Tobias said. "They don't have the luxury," Ayanna replied. "Fear wastes breath." Another voice from the dark. "Captain Morrison. Do you copy silence?" Then louder, "Any survivors respond immediately." Tobias stepped back into the house. He passed Morrison's lifeless body, barely sparing it a glance. "Time's almost up," he said. Ayanna stared into the fire. "We can't run. We can't win." "No," Tobias said, "but we can choose how we lose." Ayanna's jaw clenched. "You would die for us." Tobias looked around at his ruined home. The walls that had once kept the world out were now full of bullet holes, the floorboards soaked with blood, the ghosts of his wife and daughter long silent. "I died 8 years ago," he said. "Tonight I just want it to mean something." Ayanna stepped closer. "There may still be a way." He raised an eyebrow. "You built a dam on your land, didn't you?" she asked. "To stop flooding during the spring thaw," Tobias blinked. "Yeah. Why, if you breach it. Now, during a storm." Realization hit him like lightning. "The valley would flood," he said. "Fast, violently. If they're camped in the basin, they'd be caught in the surge." "You could drown them," Ayanna said, "but you'd also destroy everything here." Tobias looked around one last time. "My wife used to say, 'Home isn't walls, it's the people you protect.'" He met Ayanna's eyes. "Let's burn it all down." Before they could move, another voice cut through the storm. This one, younger. "Colonel Bradley, sir." "We found something." Tobias and Ayanna froze. Footsteps pounded. Then, from outside, the unmistakable cry of a baby. Tobias's blood went cold. "They found the supply wagon," he whispered. Ayanna's eyes darkened. With Mary and her child, he nodded. They must have doubled back. Then came the voice of a soldier, shaken, confused. "Sir, there's a woman here. Civilian. Says she was following Captain Morrison's orders. Claims she's just a cook." And over it all, that child's cry again, sharp, terrified. Colonel Bradley's voice thundered back, "Bring them forward." Ayanna moved to the window, peering through the broken slats. "They're using her. The baby. To bait us." Tobias clenched his fists. "They think we'll break." "They're not wrong," Ayanna whispered. But Tobias shook his head. "We can't blow the dam. Not with a child down there." Ayanna turned to him, eyes fierce. "And if we don't, we die. I'd rather die than become the kind of man who trades one innocent for another." Tobias growled. She paused. Then, slowly, she nodded. "What do we do instead?" she asked. Tobias stared into the fire as if Sarah's voice still whispered from the flames. "We become ghosts," he said. "We vanish into the storm, take their bait, and tear them apart from behind. It's suicide. It's justice." Outside, the torches advanced. A voice called once more. "This is your final warning. Surrender now." Ayanna looked at Tobias. "You sure?" He checked his rifle, his knife, the explosives in his vest. "No, but it's better than waiting to die." She gave him a tight smile. "Then let's show them what happens when the dead decide to fight back." The gunfire had stopped. For the first time in hours, the night held its breath. Tobias Redmont crouched behind a rain-slicked boulder flanked by 2 Apache women, their breaths shallow and weapons still warm. They'd circled wide through the dark, moving like ghosts through terrain. Tobias knew better than the lines in his own palm. Their target, the reserve camp where torches burned low and voices barked half-hearted orders. Confused. Tense. But the moment everything changed didn't come with a shot or a scream. It came with a whisper. Ayanna's voice, cutting through the crackling storm from the cabin's direction. "Tobias, we have Bradley's son." Tobias froze. He turned toward the house. "What?" The voice came again, low, urgent, steady. "He tried to flank us. He's inside. Alive." The full force of that sentence hit Tobias like a hammer. The son. Colonel Bradley's son. A heartbeat passed. Then 2. And Tobias moved. He sprinted through the back trail, ducking under soaked branches, boots splashing in the mud. Behind him, thunder rolled again, but it was distant now, unimportant. The battle outside had found its center. Inside the cabin, the air felt heavier, thicker. Ayanna stood near the fire blade, drawn blood trailing from a shallow cut on her shoulder. Before her, on his knees, was a boy in a soaked lieutenant's coat. Barely 20, face, pale lips trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. He looked like someone who had grown up with polished boots, gilded medals, and stories of noble war. And tonight, those stories had collapsed around him. Ayanna's knife pressed just below his ear. "Don't," Tobias said, stepping inside. "Not yet." Ayanna didn't lower the blade, but she stepped aside just enough to give Tobias space. The boy blinked up at him, water dripping from his nose. Lieutenant Tobias said calmly, "What's your name?" A moment's silence. Then, quietly, "Elias. Elias Bradley." "Of course." Tobias knelt down, eye level now. "You realize what's happened, don't you?" The boy's throat bobbed. I didn't know. They told us you were raiders, hostiles, savages. They said you burned white settlements." "They lied," Ayanna said coldly. "I didn't," Elias stammered. "I just followed orders." Tobias's eyes narrowed. So did Morrison. The boy flinched. Tobias leaned in, voice low, deliberate. "Your father sent men to burn peaceful villages. He sanctioned executions, rape, slaughter, and now he's here to bury the truth under more bodies." "I thought we were protecting settlers," Elias whispered. "You were helping erase people," Ayanna snapped. "Children, elders, my sister." Tobias held up a hand. He studied Elias's face, pale, confused, and most of all shaken. There was a crack in him, a hairline fracture of conscience, and Tobias pushed. "You want to live through this, boy?" he asked. Elias hesitated. "Yes." "Then earn it. Testify. Stand in front of every officer, every judge, every bleeding newspaper in the territory and tell them what your father's done." Ayanna's blade lowered slightly. "His word means nothing." "No," Tobias said, "but his name does." Elias's mouth opened, closed. His eyes flicked to Morrison's body, still cooling near the fireplace. "What would you have me say?" he asked, hoarse. Tobias stood. "The truth, all of it. Then what? My father hangs or walks free, Tobias said, but not with your silence helping him. Outside, a new sound rose. Not horses, not soldiers, something official. Torchlight, dozens of them. But these torches came with banners, federal banners. Ayanna moved to the window. More soldiers. Tobias peered past her. No. Investigators. Marshals, maybe. Someone's been watching Bradley, and this bloodbath finally forced their hand. He turned back to Elias. This is your chance to decide what kind of man you'll be. Your father built his name on lies. Maybe you'll build yours on truth. Elias looked up at Ayanna. Will you kill me if I don't? She didn't answer immediately. Then, no. I want you to live with the knowledge of what you were a part of. That's harder. The boy swallowed and nodded. Tobias stepped outside into the rain as the federal unit dismounted in front of his house. At their head was a U.S. Marshal with a silver badge and a face like carved granite. We received multiple reports, the Marshal barked. Who's in command here? Tobias raised a hand. Not your usual command structure, but we have a witness, Colonel Bradley's son, ready to testify. The Marshal paused, glancing toward the broken windows and the blood-soaked porch. And Colonel Bradley, he asked. Still out there, Tobias said, but his days of hiding behind stars are over. Ayanna appeared beside him. We can tell you everything, but first you need to keep your men back. Why? Because if you step wrong in that valley, Tobias said you'll lose more than boots in the mud. We rigged it to flood. The Marshal gave a slow, grim nod and lifted a hand. Stand down, he called to his men. Secure the perimeter. No one moves until I say so. Then he looked at Tobias. Let's hear your story. Dawn broke with bruised light. The storm had passed, but the battlefield it left behind still smoked ashes clinging to shattered wood blood drying into the dirt. Tobias Redmont stood in the doorway of what used to be his home, staring across the valley at the sea of uniformed strangers now occupying his land. But these men didn't wear Morrison's patchwork cruelty or Bradley's arrogance. They wore authority federal clean and dangerously curious. Dozens of marshals and military investigators moved across the ranch, gathering evidence, recording testimonies, and documenting the wreckage of what was supposed to be a quiet eradication. But instead of finding fugitives, they had uncovered a massacre prevented. And at the center of it all stood a trembling young lieutenant named Elias Bradley. He'd barely spoken as they escorted him into the large canvas command tent, but when the time came when the recorders were turned on and pens met paper, he didn't flinch. My name is Lieutenant Elias Bradley. He began, voice shaking but loud. And I am the son of Colonel Abraham Bradley. I've come to tell you what I've seen and what my father has done. The tent fell silent, and for the next hour the boy who had once followed orders without question described in excruciating detail the horrors he'd witnessed under his father's command. How Morrison's raids were no more than slaughters in uniform. How peaceful Apache villages were burned to justify federal funding. How women and children were labeled hostile to erase them without guilt. And how his father not only allowed it, but engineered it. Across the camp, men who had once served with Bradley now avoided each other's eyes. The lies that had shielded them for so long were crumbling under the weight of a single voice. Ayanna stood outside the tent, arms crossed, face unreadable. Tobias stepped beside her, watching the sun rise like a wound across the sky. You think it's enough? She asked. Tobias didn't answer right away. I think it's a start, he finally said, but only if they listen. Inside the tent, the chief investigator, a grizzled marshal named Royce, stood and turned toward his officers. Colonel Abraham Bradley, he declared, is hereby under federal arrest. He will be charged with conspiracy war crimes and abuse of military power under United States law. Gasps rose among the soldiers nearby, and as Colonel Bradley was led forward in shackles, his coat removed his medals, stripped, he locked eyes with his son. There was no rage in his stare, only disbelief. Elias didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't beg for forgiveness. He simply said, "You made me believe you were a hero. But heroes don't kill children and silence the people who survive them." Bradley's jaw twitched, but he said nothing as they dragged him away. It was over, or so it seemed. Later that morning, Tobias sat on a cracked porch step, hands bandaged, watching the marshals load evidence into wagons, maps, burned journals, dispatch orders, and the broken remains of Morrison's command. The women were gathered around the fire pit, tending to wounds, comforting the baby, and caring for the two who had fallen during the skirmish. Their bodies had been wrapped in blankets, their names spoken aloud in both English and Apache voices rising with pain and reverence. Ayanna approached Tobias, crouching beside him. "You should leave before they start asking why you had enough explosives to flood a valley." Tobias chuckled softly. "Let them ask. I've got nothing left to hide." She looked at him for a long moment. "You saved us?" "No," he said. "You saved yourselves. I just gave you the ground to do it on." She nodded. Then her voice softened. "We're heading north, to my uncle's village. It survived the first wave of raids. Maybe it can survive the aftermath, too. You think they'll leave you alone now?" Ayanna shrugged. "They might, or they might not. But this time, the world knows." Tobias looked out across the horizon. The marshals, the captured soldiers, the burned ruins of his cabin. All this, he said, started with a knock on my door. She smiled faintly, and ended with a man choosing to open it. They sat in silence as the wind picked up lighter, now cleaner, as if the storm had wrung the poison from the land. Then a soft voice cut through the quiet. "Tobias." It was Mary Hendricks, the cook who had survived the night with her infant daughter. She stood awkwardly near the barn, holding the child close, eyes weary but grateful. "They said, 'I'm free to go,'" she said. "The marshals will escort me part way to Denver, but they warn the trail's still dangerous." Ayanna looked at Tobias. He didn't need to be asked. "I'll take you," he said, "safe as I can." Mary nodded, relief flooding her features. Ayanna stood brushing the dust from her skirt. "Then I suppose this is where we part ways." Tobias stood too. He hesitated, then offered his hand. Ayanna took it. No words, no promises, just understanding. As the sun rose higher, Tobias helped Mary onto a borrowed horse, slung his rifle across his back, and led the small group west into the unknown, but not into hiding. Behind him the cabin burned. By choice, by justice, by rebirth. The ashes of the cabin smoldered behind him, drifting skyward like lost prayers. Tobias Redmont didn't look back, not once. The building had stood for over a decade, weathering storms and solitude, but it hadn't survived truth, nor was it meant to. He had built it to keep the world out, to wall off pain. But the world had knocked, and this time he had opened the door. Ahead of him the trail wound west, just beginning to drink in the pale light of morning. Mary Hendricks rode silently beside him, her infant daughter swaddled tight against her chest, sleeping through the tremble of hooves and the weight of what had been survived. Behind them, the marshals packed up the last of their gear, and behind them, the Apache women prepared to leave. Ayanna stood tall wind catching the ends of her braided hair. Beside her were the survivors, mothers, daughters, warriors, some limping, some scarred but all alive. They had been granted federal protection by the investigating authority. Compensation. Passage north. Names taken, stories recorded, promises signed. None of it could bring back what had been lost. But it gave them a future. And for people who had only known the fire of erasure, the idea of tomorrow was sacred. Tobias reined in his horse and turned to Ayanna one last time. She approached, eyes sharp as ever, but softer now, like flint that had remembered it could be warm. "You sure about this road?" she asked. He nodded. "Mary has family in Denver. She needs a guide and protection." Ayanna smirked faintly. "You're good at that." "Protection? I wasn't," he said. "Not when it mattered most." Ayanna studied his face for a long moment. "Maybe it matters now." Tobias looked out toward the rising sun. For 8 years he had lived among shadows, half a man in a house built of silence. But these women had dragged the world back to his doorstep, and instead of retreating, he'd answered. They'd made him remember what it meant to stand for something again, to belong to something again. "I'm not a soldier anymore," he said, "not a builder, not even a rancher." Ayanna tilted her head. "Then what are you?" Tobias exhaled, slow and sure, "A man who protects what still matters." She nodded, satisfied, then handed him something. It was a simple cord of woven leather bearing 3 colored beads and a small bone carved into the shape of a hawk's talon. "For the road," she said, "so you don't forget who you became." He accepted it with both hands. "And if someone asks where I got it," Ayanna smiled. "Tell them the truth. A ghost gave it to you. A ghost who refused to stay dead." With that, she turned back toward her people. The women were already mounted. The baby, who had survived the storm, was now awake, cooing softly as her mother whispered something in Apache. They rode north. Tobias watched them vanish into the hills, their silhouettes growing smaller until the last braid dipped below the ridge. He stood still for a while. Then he climbed into the saddle, adjusted his rifle, and led Mary down the western path. They rode slow, cautious. The road ahead was not friendly, and old enemies had long memories. But Tobias Redmont no longer rode to escape. He rode to guard, to stand watch at the edge of someone else's safety. And in doing so, maybe finally he found a way to live. The wind shifted. It no longer whispered Sarah's name in sorrow. It carried it forward. That night, they camped beneath a sky so clear it felt like glass. Mary sang to her baby in soft tones. Tobias sat beside the fire, hands outstretched, warmth creeping into bones long cold. He didn't speak much, not yet, but when he slept, he dreamed not of fire and screams, but of a cabin on a hill where voices laughed and no one knocked out of fear. And when dawn came again, he was ready to ride farther, to find the next soul worth saving. The valley was quiet now. No more gunfire, no more thunder, just the hum of wind moving through the grass and the soft groan of trees returning to stillness. In the wake of the storm, something else had settled truth. Not the kind written in newspapers or carved into metals, but the kind that lived in scars, in silence, in choices made when no one was watching. Tobias Redmont sat alone beneath a crooked cottonwood near the edge of the trail. Mary and her baby were asleep beside the campfire, wrapped in a blanket stitched with initials Tobias didn't recognize. Probably her grandmother's. Probably the last piece of a family that war hadn't stolen. He stared into the flames, his thoughts drifting. It would have been easier to close the door. It always had been. Easier to ignore the knock, easier to pretend the world beyond the fence line wasn't burning. But what Ayanna had said kept echoing in his mind. You don't stop being human just because the world forgets how. He thought about what it had taken to open that door, to set down the rifle, to let people in again, not just into his home, but into the broken, splintered place he'd hidden inside himself for 8 long years. And he realized something. Survival was instinct, but kindness. That was a choice, the harder one, the braver one, because to be kind in a cruel world was to risk everything to lose your peace, your safety, even your life. And yet, it was the only thing that ever changed anything. Ayanna and her sisters had fought not just to stay alive, but to preserve something deeper dignity, truth, the right to exist without begging for it. They had been hunted not because they were dangerous, but because they refused to die quietly. And in their refusal, they awakened something buried in Tobias. Not vengeance, not duty, but humanity. He hadn't become a hero that night. He had simply remembered who he once was before grief, before rage, before silence swallowed him whole. The fire cracked. The baby stirred, let out a soft breath, and fell still again. Tobias stood walking to the edge of the ridge. Below the valley stretched for miles green, now alive, untouched by the blood it had almost swallowed. Somewhere beyond those trees, Ayanna's people were rebuilding, and somewhere to the east, a disgraced colonel sat in a federal cell stripped of rank, stripped of story, all because someone had chosen to speak, chosen to act, chosen to be human. Tobias touched the woven cord around his wrist, the one Ayanna had given him. Its beads caught the firelight dull and perfect. He would carry it forever, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Of the night he stopped surviving and started living again. Of the moment when violence stood at his door and he answered not with hate, but with courage. Because in the end, it wasn't war that defined them. It wasn't uniforms or rifles or blood spilled on the floorboards. It was the fire shared, the baby protected, the stranger helped without expectation, humanity. Tobias had come to understand isn't found in the easy moments. It's forged in the impossible ones when doing the right thing might cost you everything and you choose it anyway. The wind picked up again, soft and warm this time, carrying with it no screams, no commands, just the breath of something sacred. Hope. Tobias turned back toward the fire. Tomorrow they would ride farther. There would be more dangers, more wounds, more choices. But tonight he rested beside the proof that being human still mattered, and that sometimes when the world is at its worst, choosing kindness is the bravest kind of war.